What hidden truths lie behind the symbols and rituals of one of the world's oldest and most misunderstood secret societies? And how did a fraternity of stonemasons come to influence philosophy, spirituality, and even the course of history? Today we will follow the trail from the medieval guilds of stonemasons to the mysteries of the Knights Templar, from early Masonic manuscripts to the flowering of speculative Freemasonry. This is not just history, it is the story of how human labor became a metaphor for the soul's transformation. Many of us have seen these symbols of Freemasonry on the cornerstones of churches or public buildings, on gravestones, as emblems on rings or license plates, or shown endlessly in conspiracy forums. But how did this fraternity truly originate? In the heart of medieval Europe, long before the metaphors inherent in Freemasonry appeared, there were operative guilds of stonemasons. These guilds were communities of working men, charged with the construction of cathedrals, castles, and bridges. Their craft was indispensable, for no civilization of that age could flourish without masons. But their importance lay not only in skill. They carried codes of morality, systems of apprenticeship, and symbolic tools that would survive long after the stones were set. An apprentice would begin at a young age, perhaps at the age of 12. He would live with his master, not merely as a laborer, but as a member of the household. He learned to cut stone, to measure with compasses, to square angles, and to work with precision. But alongside these lessons, he was taught honesty, loyalty, secrecy, and reverence for God. The tools of the trade became teaching devices. The square instructed him in fairness, the compass in balance, the plumb line in upright conduct. These tools were not only instruments of architecture, but allegories for moral life. Geometry was not only science, but sacred philosophy. To build was to participate in creation itself. The medieval stoneworker inhabited a world where the sacred and the profane were inseparably intertwined. Unlike other craftsmen, who worked with materials that could be easily replaced or repaired, the mason worked with stone, a material that demanded precision, planning, and a deep understanding of structural principles. A poorly cut stone could compromise an entire cathedral wall. An improperly calculated arch could bring down decades of labor. This inherent demand for precision fostered a culture of exactitude, secrecy, and mutual dependence that distinguished the mason's craft from all others. Let's briefly examine the deeper historical roots that may have influenced the development of medieval stonemason guilds. The Roman Collegia, popular from the 1st through 5th centuries CE, represented sophisticated trade associations that combined practical craft instruction with mutual support, religious observance, and social networking. These organizations developed many of the structural elements that would later characterize medieval guilds, namely hierarchy, systems of apprenticeship, secret modes of recognition, and charitable obligations toward members and their families. The Comacine or Comacine masters, operating in medieval Lombardy from approximately the 7th through 13th centuries CE, represent a crucial link between Roman craft traditions and the later development of European stonemason guilds. Documentary evidence from the Lombard period reveals that these master builders possessed a sophisticated organizational structure, with magistri or masters and discipuli or students under a gestaldo or grand master, terminology that closely parallels later Masonic organizational patterns. The Comacine masters employed distinctive working tools, recognition methods, and symbolic elements that appear in later Masonic tradition. Square, compasses, level, plumb line, and arch appear among their emblems, as does the King Solomon's knot, a biblical figure who is central to the later rites of Freemasonry. They wore distinctive clothing, including white aprons and gloves, elements that would later appear in speculative Masonic practice. Perhaps most significantly, the Comacine masters called their meeting places loggia and maintained systems of oaths, tokens, grips, and passwords that created bonds of union transcending legal and geographic boundaries. These organizational elements suggest the preservation and development of Roman collegial traditions within a Christian context, creating institutional frameworks that could accommodate both practical craft instruction and spiritual or philosophical development. The migration of these building traditions throughout medieval Europe, particularly into France, Germany, and the British Isles, may have established the foundational patterns that would later evolve into the sophisticated guild systems. These earlier practices created a cultural matrix capable of accommodating the hermetic and philosophical influences that would later transform operative stonemasonry, which was grounded in the literal working of stone, into speculative Freemasonry, grounded in the metaphorical and the mystical workings of the soul. But guilds were not the only communities that were shaping the spiritual imagination of Europe. Another order, born in Jerusalem and extinguished in fire, left behind legends that forever altered the symbolic world of the West, including the rites of Freemasonry and beyond. These were the Knights Templar. No investigation of Freemasonry's esoteric origins would be complete without examining the controversial question of potential connections to the Knights Templar. This medieval military religious order developed organizational and initiatory characteristics that have led many scholars to speculate about its influence on later esoteric societies, including Freemasonry. Founded in 1119 CE, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, known simply as the Knights Templar, were initially a small band of warriors charged with protecting pilgrims in the Holy Land. Yet, within a century, they had grown into one of the most powerful institutions in Christendom. They combined monastic vows and solemn initiation rites with military discipline, creating a unique order where knights lived as monks and fought as soldiers. Their white mantles, emblazoned with a red cross, came to symbolize sacrifice and purity. Their rule of life required obedience, chastity, and poverty, though paradoxically they became extraordinarily wealthy. They pioneered systems of finance, issuing letters of credit that allowed pilgrims to travel safely. In effect, they became the bankers of Europe. The Knights Templar emerged from the crucible of the Crusades as a unique synthesis of martial prowess, religious devotion, and financial innovation. Their exposure to diverse religious and philosophical traditions during their presence in the Holy Land may have facilitated the synthesis of Christian, Islamic, Jewish, and Hermetic elements that would later characterize much of Western esoteric thought. In 1307, everything changed. King Philip IV of France, deeply indebted to the Templars, orchestrated their downfall. On Friday, October 13th of that year, he ordered the arrest of Grand Master Jacques de Molay and countless brethren. The charges brought against them included heresy, blasphemy, idolatry, and financial corruption. These charges were almost certainly contrived to provide legal justification for the seizure of the Templar wealth and the elimination of their political independence. Under torture, many Templars confessed to various crimes, though Grand Master Jacques de Molay later recanted his confession before papal representatives, displaying the physical evidence of his torture. Pope Clement V initially resisted King Philip IV's actions, but eventually yielded to political pressure and issued the papal bull, Pastoralis Praemunentiae, in November 1307, ordering the arrest of the Templars throughout Christian Europe. The order was formally suppressed by the papal bull, Vox in Excelso, in 1312, and Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake as a relapsed heretic in March 1314. Before he died, Jacques de Molay reportedly proclaimed his innocence and summoned his persecutors to divine judgment. Chroniclers note that both Pope and King died within the year. The destruction of the Templars only magnified their mystique. Legends spread of hidden treasures, secret knowledge, and initiatory wisdom preserved in their ranks. The connection between this suppressed order and later Freemasonry has been the subject of extensive scholarly debate. The popular theory that after the suppression of their order, the Templars took refuge with the Freemasons of Scotland and thus imparted something of their ritual or organization to the craft, is one for which no historical evidence exists. It is but a theory, attractive and romantic, yet without proof. The connection of the Templars with early Freemasonry is unsupported by authentic records, but the Templar legend remains a cherished tradition within some branches of the order. Here lies a key truth. Whether or not Masonry descends institutionally from the Templars, it absorbed their imagery, their sense of secrecy, and their aura of martyrdom. The symbolic and spiritual legacy of the Templars clearly influenced the development of higher Masonic degrees, particularly those associated with Scottish Rite and York Rite systems, which we will soon discuss. But what about the documents? The writings that reveal how Masonry transformed from the literal to the metaphorical, from the operative stonemason guilds to what was called speculative Freemasonry. These manuscripts were called the Old Charges, and they give us a direct window into the early soul of the craft. This transformation from operative craft to speculative philosophy did not occur in a vacuum, nor was it a sudden innovation of the early 18th century. The evidence suggests a gradual evolution that accelerated significantly during the 17th century as social, intellectual, and spiritual circumstances converged to create conditions favorable for this metamorphosis. The earliest Masonic documents, approximately 130 in number, written between the 14th and 18th centuries, were called the Old Charges. They blend legendary history with operative rules, weaving together biblical figures, classical wisdom, and moral teachings. The earliest documented evidence of these structured guilds appears in the Regius poem from around the year 1390, which presents what scholars consider the first written codification of Masonic principles and regulations. This remarkable document, consisting of 794 verses in Middle English, established 15 articles and 15 points governing the conduct of Masons, both within their lodges and in their interactions with the broader society. The Regius poem is unique among early guild documents in being written in verse form, suggesting that its moral and practical instructions were meant to be memorized and recited, creating a living tradition of oral instruction that paralleled the written regulations. This document connects the craft of Masonry with the history of geometry and with biblical traditions. It claims that Euclid taught geometry in Egypt, presenting the craft as divinely inspired. It also stresses morality. Masons were to be honest, loyal, and faithful to God and King. Following closely upon the Regius poem, the Cooke manuscript from around the year 1410 expanded upon the legendary history of Masonry, incorporating elements from biblical narratives and classical philosophy to establish the divine and ancient origins of the craft. This text traces Masonry back to the children of Lamech in Genesis and to Nimrod, the builder of the Tower of Babel. By linking Masonry to sacred history, it asserts divine legitimacy. The manuscript also lays down operative rules for training apprentices, resolving disputes, and governing conduct. In Scotland, William Schaw, Master of Works to King James VI, issued the Schaw Statutes of 1598 and 1599. These regulations formalized the organization and ethical expectations of Scottish stonemasons, while introducing hierarchical structures and evidence of speculative elements that transcended mere operative concerns. The Schaw Statutes represent a crucial evolutionary moment where practical guild organization began to accommodate non-operative members and philosophical instruction alongside technical training. These statutes open with the following. First, they shall observe and keep all the good ordinances established before concerning the privileges of their craft by their predecessors of good memory, and especially they shall be true to one another and live charitably together, as becometh sworn brethren and companions of the craft. They show operative guilds evolving toward speculative elements, emphasizing not only craft but also knowledge, morality, and order. The Edinburgh manuscript of 1696 provides crucial evidence of this transitional period, containing what scholars recognize as the earliest known written version of a Masonic catechism and ritual. This document, formally titled "Some Questions That Masons Use to Put to These Who Profess to Have the Mason Word Before They Will Acknowledge Them," reveals a system of recognition and instruction that had evolved far beyond purely operative concerns. The catechism format, with its questions and answers designed to establish identity and convey instruction, demonstrates the emergence of pedagogical methods that would become central to speculative Masonic practice. The Edinburgh Manuscript introduces several elements that would prove foundational to later speculative development: the concept of the Mason word, the 5 points of fellowship, and ritualized modes of recognition. These innovations suggest that by the late 17th century, Masonic gatherings had begun to serve educational and initiatory functions that transcended the purely practical needs of operative stonework. The Edinburgh Manuscript's emphasis on secrecy, symbolic instruction, and graduated revelation indicates the presence of esoteric elements that would later be systematized in speculative Freemasonry. No longer was the focus only on stone, now it was on symbol, initiation, and allegory. Together, these old charges, of which we have only covered a few of the most important, form the bridge. They demonstrate how operative Masonry, with its technical and ethical codes, gave birth to speculative Freemasonry, where symbol and morality overshadowed the literal elements of the craft. Elias Ashmole, an antiquarian and alchemist, is among the earliest recorded speculative Freemasons, whose 1646 initiation illustrates the transition of the craft from operative stonemasonry into a symbolic and philosophical fraternity. The old charges reveal that medieval Masons possessed not merely technical knowledge, but a comprehensive worldview that situated their craft within the broader context of sacred geometry, divine architecture, and cosmic order. Arthur Edward Waite, himself a practitioner of Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, and Hermetic arts, proposed that despite extensive research into the old charges and other Masonic documents, the true origins of speculative Freemasonry remain obscure, with its emergence in early 18th century London appearing more as a sudden manifestation than a clearly traceable development. Waite suggested that the most plausible source of influence lies in the English Hermetic schools, namely the alchemical, Rosicrucian, and Kabbalistic systems, which shared symbolic and initiatory features that likely contributed to Freemasonry's formation. Waite's analysis gains weight through his deep involvement in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, and several Masonic bodies, which gave him first-hand knowledge of symbolic and ritual systems. Hermeticism emphasized graduated revelation through symbols. Alchemy framed transformation as both material and spiritual, and Kabbalah offered a cosmology of divine emanation and microcosm-macrocosm relationships. Together, these traditions provided intellectual and symbolic foundations that could elevate operative craft into speculative philosophy. The Rosicrucian manifestos of the early 17th century, discussed in our last video, introduced a vision of hidden brotherhoods devoted to spiritual enlightenment, alchemy, and the reformation of knowledge, which captivated the intellectual climate of Europe. Rosicrucian thinkers like Michael Meyer, Robert Flood, and Johann Valentin André inspired early Masonic minds with their emphasis on hidden wisdom, symbolic allegory, and the marriage of science with spirituality. From this current, Rosicrucian ideals of esoteric brotherhood and universal reformation gradually merged with the organizational structure of craft guilds, giving rise to speculative Freemasonry in the following century as a vessel for transmitting both moral philosophy and mystical symbolism, using secrecy as a methodological tool. By the 18th century, the bridge was crossed. Freemasonry was no longer a loose association of operative stonemasons. It was a structured fraternity. Speculative Freemasonry had emerged, fully formed, with a system of degrees, rituals, and lodges that reshaped the spiritual and social fabric of Europe. Freemasonry began to spread rapidly. The year 1717 is a great milestone in the history of the fraternity. In London, 4 lodges united to form the first Grand Lodge, establishing centralized authority. This Grand Lodge issued charters, creating a network across Britain, Europe, and the colonies. The fraternity attracted nobles, scholars, and revolutionaries. It became a meeting place where men of different classes and faiths could gather in equality. called meeting on the level in Masonic vocabulary. The formation of the Grand Lodge was the culmination of a complex tapestry of spiritual, philosophical, and practical traditions that converged in the crucible of the Enlightenment to produce something entirely unprecedented in human history, a universal fraternity that employed the tools and symbols of medieval stonework as vehicles for moral and spiritual instruction. The formalization of this transformation reached its culmination with the publication of James Anderson's Constitutions of the Freemasons in 1723. Anderson's work, commissioned by the newly formed Grand Lodge of London and Westminster, represented a deliberate attempt to codify and universalize the principles that had been developing within Masonic circles for decades. In Anderson's time, only 2 degrees are clearly attested: Entered Apprentice and Fellowcraft, with the 3rd degree of Master Mason not yet fully developed. Anderson's constitutions transformed local craft traditions into a universal system of moral instruction accessible to men of all social classes and occupational backgrounds. They situated Freemasonry within a grand historical narrative that traced the craft's origins to biblical times, while emphasizing its compatibility with Enlightenment values of reason, tolerance, and social progress. Most significantly, they established organizational structures that could accommodate rapid geographic expansion while maintaining doctrinal and ritual consistency through a universal system of ethics. The dramatic nature of the craft's transformation becomes evident when we examine Samuel Pritchard's Masonry Dissected, published in 1730. This expose reveals that by 1730, Freemasonry had developed a sophisticated 3-degree system centered around the dramatic legend of Hiram Abiff, known as the Hiramic Legend. The 2 degrees found in Anderson's Constitutions of the Freemasons had now added the 3rd degree of Master Mason in the 7 years since Anderson's work was published. Each degree was a stage of initiation, full of allegory and symbol. The Hiramic Legend, with its themes of fidelity, death, and resurrection, provided speculative Freemasonry with a central myth that transformed the practical concerns of medieval stonemasons into universal allegories of moral development and spiritual transformation. The symbolic richness of the Hiramic Legend enables multiple levels of interpretation that accommodate both simple moral instruction and sophisticated esoteric development. The story can be understood as an allegory of personal integrity, a representation of seasonal cycles, a metaphor for the soul's journey through incarnation, or a symbolic enactment of initiatory death and rebirth. This interpretive flexibility allowed speculative Freemasonry to serve simultaneously as a system of practical ethics and a vehicle for spiritual transformation. The creation and integration of the Hiramic Legend represents the successful synthesis of all the historical influences that we have examined: the organizational structures of medieval guilds, the symbolic vocabularies of Hermetic traditions, the philosophical frameworks of ancient mysteries, and the practical wisdom of operative craftsmen. But opposition to Freemasonry came swiftly. Issued on April 28th of 1738, Pope Clement XII's papal bull, In Eminenti Apostolatus Specula, represents the first official Catholic condemnation of Freemasonry. This condemnation came remarkably early in Freemasonry's development, only 21 years after the formation of the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster, suggesting that church authorities quickly recognized the organization's potential for challenging traditional religious and political arrangements. Clement XII's bull identified several concerns that would characterize Catholic opposition to Freemasonry throughout subsequent centuries. The Pope expressed particular alarm at the organization's secrecy, noting that members were bound as well by a stringent oath sworn upon the sacred volume, as by the imposition of heavy penalties to conceal under inviolable silence what they secretly do in their meetings. This emphasis on secrecy violated traditional Catholic expectations that all legitimate spiritual and moral instruction should occur under ecclesiastical supervision. The bull also criticized Freemasonry's acceptance of men of any religion and sect whatsoever, content with a certain affectation of natural virtue. This religious inclusivity directly challenged Catholic claims to exclusive spiritual authority and the necessity of church mediation for salvation. The Masonic emphasis on natural virtue, reason, and universal moral principles represented a fundamental theological challenge to doctrines requiring specific religious beliefs and ecclesiastical membership for moral and spiritual development. The practical impact of this condemnation extended far beyond theological disagreement. The bull imposed automatic excommunication upon Catholics who joined Masonic lodges, effectively excluding them from the sacraments and Christian burial. This severe penalty remained in effect through multiple papal reaffirmations until modifications in the 20th century, demonstrating the Church's perception of Freemasonry as a serious threat to Catholic authority. The consistency and intensity of Catholic opposition, involving 8 different popes issuing condemnations between 1738 and 1917, indicates that church authorities understood Freemasonry to represent more than a simple social organization, and suggests recognition that Freemasonry offered an alternative system of moral instruction, spiritual development, and social organization that could compete effectively with traditional Catholic institutions. The 1983 Code of Canon Law removed the penalty of automatic excommunication for Catholics joining Masonic lodges, a penalty present in the previous 1917 code. However, a declaration on Masonic associations was issued by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in 1983, explicitly stating that the Church's negative judgment of Freemasonry remains unchanged. Membership is still prohibited, and such affiliation places a Catholic in a state of grave sin, barring them from receiving Holy Communion. Despite this, Masonry flourished, especially in Protestant lands. The opposition from the Catholic Church, rather than hindering Masonic growth, may have actually accelerated its development by forcing adherents to articulate more clearly their principles and practices, while maintaining greater organizational independence from traditional religious authorities. The transformation from operative to speculative Freemasonry created an institutional innovation that continues to influence Western culture, a voluntary association dedicated to moral development, charitable service, and spiritual growth that remains accessible to men of diverse backgrounds while maintaining substantial intellectual and symbolic sophistication. This achievement represents the successful preservation and adaptation of esoteric traditions within modern social contexts, creating a bridge between ancient wisdom and contemporary needs. We have covered much of the historical lineage of the craft as well as the documents that shape the fraternity. But what about the symbols? What about the organizational structure? And what about the legacy of the Freemasons that endured from the formation of the United States onward into the present day? Freemasonry adopted the symbols of the square and compasses and the letter G gradually, with the square and compasses dating back to the 17th century, and the letter G becoming commonly seen with this symbol around the mid-18th century, solidifying its presence in the late 18th to mid-19th century, particularly in the United States. The exact origin of the combined symbol is unclear, but it evolved from the working tools of stonemasons. The Masonic letter G has been interpreted in multiple complementary ways. For some, it stands for God, the divine architect who orders the cosmos. For others, it recalls geometry, the sacred science through which creation is measured and understood. And in more esoteric readings, it signifies the generative principle, the creative power of life itself. Alongside this letter, the square and compass embody the union of two realms, with the square symbolizing the material and earthly plane, while the compass represents the spiritual and infinite. Together they express the balance of body and soul, matter and spirit, reminding the Mason that true mastery arises from harmonizing the visible and invisible dimensions of existence. The lambskin apron in Freemasonry symbolizes purity of life, innocence, and the moral duty of the initiate to live uprightly, Worn during rituals and preserved as a lifelong emblem, it serves as a constant reminder that a Mason's true legacy is measured by virtue rather than material achievement. It also connects modern Freemasons to ancient guild traditions of operative stonemasons, where aprons were both practical garments and marks of craftsmanship, now transformed into symbols of spiritual labor. Several of the American founding fathers, including George Washington, Ben Franklin, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, were active Freemasons, drawing on the order's emphasis on reason, liberty, and fraternity as guiding principles in shaping the new republic. Across the Atlantic, in Bavaria, Adam Weishaupt's short-lived Illuminati emerged in 1776 as a secret society that adopted Masonic structures and symbols, but sought to push them further into radical Enlightenment ideals of rationalism and opposition to clerical and monarchical authority. While distinct in purpose, both movements became historically entangled in the public imagination, giving rise to enduring associations between Freemasonry, revolutionary change, and hidden influence. 14 American presidents, from George Washington to Gerald Ford, were Freemasons, reflecting the fraternity's deep historical presence in the nation's political and civic leadership. The Masonic appendant bodies of the present day are organizations that extend and elaborate upon the teachings, rituals, and symbolism of the foundational craft, or Blue Lodge, degrees of entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason. Among the most influential are the Scottish Rite, which develops complex moral and philosophical lessons through degrees that explore themes of justice, liberty, and esoteric wisdom, through references to Greek philosophy, ancient Egyptian religion, Zoroastrianism, mystical Islam known as Sufism, mystical Judaism known as Kabbalah, mystical Christianity, as well as Hinduism and beyond, all displayed in allegorical format for candidates to witness and digest. The York Rite deepens biblical allegory and culminates in the chivalric orders of Knights Templar, an exclusively Christian branch of the fraternal tree. The Shriners, or ancient Arabic order of the nobles of the mystic shrine, emphasize fellowship and philanthropy while maintaining ritualistic connections to Masonic tradition and mystical Islam. The Scottish Rite and Shriners both support hospitals that provide specialized pediatric care, offering treatment for conditions such as orthopedic disorders, burns, spinal injuries, and cleft palate, always regardless of the family's ability to pay. While the York Rite's primary philanthropy centers on medical research and patient support, most notably funding efforts against diseases of the eye, heart, and esophagus through organizations such as the Knights Templar Eye Foundation and related charitable programs. Other appendant bodies such as the Order of the Eastern Star for female relatives of Masons, de Molay for young men and the sons of Masons, and Rainbow Girls for young women and the daughters of Masons expand the reach of Masonic influence to families and youth. Collectively, these bodies provide avenues for Masons to engage in further symbolic exploration, charity, and community, while reinforcing the larger Masonic mission of moral refinement and spiritual growth through allegory, ritual, and service. Albert Pike, in his monumental work Morals and Dogma of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, argued that Freemasonry preserves a lineage rooted in Hermeticism, Kabbalah, Neoplatonism, and Christian mysticism. He presented it as a modern continuation of the ancient mysteries, veiling sacred teachings in allegory and symbol during times of persecution. W. L. Wilmshurst, in The Meaning of Masonry, offered a spiritual complement to Pike's historical view, presenting Masonic ritual as a science of the soul's descent into matter and return to the divine through initiation. He framed Masonry as a form of spiritual alchemy, where ceremony and symbolism function outwardly as visible rites, yet inwardly as vehicles of hidden wisdom. The convergence of Pike's historical scholarship and Wilmshurst's spiritual interpretation suggests that Freemasonry's significance lies not merely in its preservation of ancient symbols and ceremonies, but in its continued capacity to serve as a vehicle for spiritual development and philosophical instruction. Freemasonry today is remembered both as a fraternal order that shapes civic life through ideals of brotherhood moral discipline, and charitable works, and as a guardian of symbolic traditions, linking ancient philosophy with Enlightenment rationality. Its rituals and symbols continue to inspire esoteric study, while its lodges maintain influence in philanthropy, public service, and the preservation of initiatory knowledge. At the same time, the mystique of secrecy around its practices has ensured that Freemasonry remains a source of cultural fascination, speculation, and myth in the modern imagination. The operative guilds created the vessel, Hermetic philosophy provided the content, and the genius of 18th century innovators achieved the synthesis that produced one of history's most enduring and influential esoteric institutions. In the end, Freemasonry stands at the crossroads of conspiracy, myth, legend, and history, an institution both veiled and revealed, at once practical and profoundly symbolic. Whether one sees it as a fraternity of moral builders or a vessel of ancient mysteries, its enduring presence invites us not only to question the past, but to reflect on the deeper architecture of the human spirit. In our next video, we will move beyond Freemasonry into the modern flowering of esoteric orders that reshape the spiritual landscape of the 19th and 20th centuries. Having already covered the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and modern Rosicrucian movements in our last video, we will explore the visionary societies founded by Helena Blavatsky, Aleister Crowley, Rudolf Steiner, Papoose, and Paul Foster Case, each offering a distinct path through the mysteries of philosophy, ritual, and inner transformation. Together, they reveal how the ancient currents of wisdom did not end with Freemasonry, but evolved into new forms that continue to influence seekers today. Join us next time as we examine how Freemasonry, drawing on Rosicrucianism from our last video, shaped later occult orders and secret societies, providing the contextual framework for the rise of esoteric spirituality outside of orthodoxy. What's next for S.E.E.K after the conclusion of our Western esoteric journey? Like and subscribe to find out. Thank you for watching. Find more at joinseek.org.